Sir, you need to move to economy, the flight attendant told him. First class is for premium passengers only, the man replied. The woman didn't know who she was talking to, and by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane doors were open, and people were slowly making their way to their seats. Ethan Vance took a seat in first class and put his bag neatly under the chair in front of him. He adjusted his seatbelt and felt the smooth leather against his back. It was a treat for him that he rarely gave himself because he had always been about giving to others, his students, his school, his community, but this time he had given himself something special, a break he had been putting off for far too long. He looked out the window at the busy runway and didn't know that his moment of peace was about to end when a shadow fell over him. He turned around to see Miss Chandler, a flight attendant, standing next to him. She was tall and poised, with sharp eyes that saw everything. But there was something else in her face that suggested she was doubtful. Ethan nodded, reached into his pocket, and handed her the piece of paper without hesitation. She raised an eyebrow and said, "This is for first class," sounding skeptical. "Yes," Ethan replied calmly. Miss Chandler looked at him for a moment, then pressed her lips together and asked, "Are you?" Several passengers turned their heads slightly, some pretended not to hear, while others watched with quiet interest. Ethan slowly breathed out, "No mistake, I bought it myself." Miss Chandler let out a small impatient sigh. "Right, I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." Ethan held her gaze for a moment before nodding. He unbuckled his seat belt and stood his presence, quiet but firm, the other first. People in first class avoided eye contact and pretended not to notice what was going on. Miss Chandler motioned for him to follow her to the galley, where she picked up the in-flight phone and punched in a code. She spoke in a lower voice, but Ethan could still hear the anger in her tone. After a moment, she turned back to him with a fake smile and said, "There seems to be a problem with your booking. We can offer you a seat in economy while we figure this out." Ethan's jaw tensed, but he kept his cool. She smiled less and said, "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself. Please take your things and move to economy." The energy in the cabin changed, and people in economy started to raise their heads to see what was going on. A quiet murmur spread through the plane like a slow wave. Ethan looked at Chandler for a long time. He could tell from the look in her face that she didn't want him here, no matter what he said or what his ticket said. He didn't say another word. He turned around, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. He pulled it out of the overhead bin, slid the strap over his shoulder, and started walking down the aisle toward economy. He could feel people following him down the stairs. Some were interested, others were silently critical, but no one spoke up or said a word. Ethan sat down in an empty seat in economy and took a slow breath. The space was smaller and the seat was rougher, but it wasn't the downgrade that bothered him, it was the shame. He looked at his phone before he spoke. Ethan finally typed a message, boarded and was moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to properly check my ticket. Hit send. A few seconds later his phone vibrated. "What do you mean they moved you?" Ethan's eyes flickered to the front of the plane, where Miss Chandler was continuing her duties without realizing the mistake she had just made. Another message came up, "Give me the flight number." Ethan typed it in. There was a long pause. Then the last message came, "Sit tight, this isn't over." Ethan sat in his squished economy seat with his fingers on the phone. As he stared out the small window, the hum of the engine filled the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent his whole life teaching respect, fairness, and patience, but now he had been fired without question or hesitation, as if he weren't there. The first-class passengers who had seen him being led away went back to their conversations, drinks, and comfort. No one had spoken up or asked if he needed help. His phone rang again. It was the attendant. Ethan rubbed his temple and typed back. Noting that he didn't catch her first name, Ethan let out a breath. He didn't know what was going on the other end of the conversation, but he trusted it. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Chandler poured herself a quick cup of coffee while ignoring the looks from the other flight attendants. One of them, a younger woman named Sienna, hesitated before asking, "Is there a problem with that man's ticket?" Miss Chandler rolled her eyes and said, "He was sitting in first class," and Sienna frowned and said, "Yes, but you saw him." Chandler spoke up, taking a sip of coffee as she said, "He didn't look like a first-class passenger. Either there was a mistake in the system or someone gave him the ticket. Either way, I wasn't going to let him sit up there when he clearly didn't belong." Sienna's stomach turned, and she wanted to say something to push Chandler back, but she knew she shouldn't because Miss Chandler had been with the airline for years and was known for being strict and never admitting she was wrong. She looked toward first class. When Ethan's phone rang again, it was a new message. "What gate are you landing at?" He raised an eyebrow and then checked his boarding pass, which was tucked into his seat pocket. He sent the date number back, and there was a pause before the last message came, "Understand, just stay put." Ethan leaned back in his seat and watched the flight attendants move around the cabin, serving drinks and adjusting trays as if nothing had happened, but something told him something wasn't right. He wasn't even close to being done. Miss Chandler moved through the first-class cabin, moving trays and serving drinks, completely unaffected by what had just happened. She had seen many people try to sneak into first class over the years, and she didn't see this as any different. The man took his seat without protesting, which only proved what she already thought: he didn't belong there. But what she didn't know was that her choice had set off a chain reaction in the cockpit that she wasn't ready for. Rowan Hughes got an urgent message on the in-flight communication line. As soon as he saw the name on it, his eyes narrowed, and he looked at the co-pilot with a serious face. "Pull up the passenger manifest," he said. The co-pilot frowned but did what he was asked, tapping a few buttons on the screen before the list of names appeared. The names scrolled quickly until they stopped on Ethan Vance's. Captain Hughes read the details twice, his heart racing a little because he knew that name. Industry knew that name. He looked back at the message on his screen and saw that it asked him to confirm right away if Ethan Vance was taken out of first class. The co-pilot glanced over and could feel the tension in the air. Is that the Ethan Vance? Captain Hughes didn't answer right away because he was already thinking about what would happen next. He reached for the in-flight phone and called the lead flight attendant line. A few seconds later, Chandler's voice came through, clear and calm. "This is Chandler, Captain." Hughes's voice stayed steady, but there was a new weight to his words. "Miss Chandler, I need to confirm something. Did you remove a first-class passenger named Ethan Vance?" The other person's voice went quiet for a moment, then came back with a competent answer. "Yes, Captain. His ticket didn't match his first-class status, so I had him moved to economy." Hughes's grip on the phone tightened a little, and he asked, "Did you verify his ticket?" Chandler let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh someone gives when they think they're being questioned about nothing. "Captain, I have worked in flights for over 10 years and can tell when someone doesn't belong in first class." There was a longer pause before Captain Hughes spoke again, but this time his voice was colder and more precise. "Miss Chandler, do you know who Ethan Vance is?" he asked. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Ethan Vance is the owner of this airline." The phone line went dead. For the first time since the flight began, Miss Chandler felt something she had never felt before. Before she made a mistake that couldn't be fixed, Miss Chandler stood frozen, her grip on the in-flight phone getting tighter. For the first time in her career, she felt a sharp sting of panic. The silence between her and Captain Hughes was thick and suffocating, and she tried to process what he had just said, but her mind wouldn't let go of Ethan Vance, the owner of the airline number. He didn't look like someone who owned an airline, he wasn't wearing a suit, he wasn't acting. He had just sat there quietly, acting cocky. Miss Chandler forced herself to speak, but her voice lacked the confidence she usually has when she says things like, "There must be some mistake." Captain Hughes replied, "Mr. Vance was a confirmed first-class passenger, and you removed him without verifying his ticket. Now we have direct orders from the executive office." Miss Chandler could feel the blood draining from her face as Captain Hughes spoke more. "You are to personally escort Mr. Vance back to first class and apologize to the public upon landing. You will also have to report to the executive board for a formal review of this incident." Miss Chandler's throat tightened at the thought of a formal review. This wasn't a small complaint, this was something much bigger. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. "Captain, I was just following protocol." There was a short pause, and then Captain Hughes said, "No, Miss Chandler, you weren't." The line went dead. Slowly put down the phone, her hands shaking a little. The other flight attendants could tell that something was different about her. Sienna, the member attendant, hesitated before speaking. "Everything okay?" Miss Chandler asked. Her mind was racing. She had always thought she was in charge of situations like this. She had worked on hundreds of flights and made dozens of decisions without ever being questioned like this. But now she wasn't. She was about to walk back into economy class. As Miss Chandler made her way down the narrow aisle toward economy, her legs felt heavy because she had just embarrassed the most powerful man on the plane, and what was worse, she had no idea how he would react. Each step made the realization sink in even more. She had embarrassed the airline owner in front of the whole cabin of passengers by ignoring him, talking down to him, and kicking him out of a seat he had paid for, and now she had to face him. The economy section was a mess. It was quieter than before, but some people could already tell something was wrong. Their eyes kept moving between Miss Chandler and Ethan, who was sitting calmly in his seat with his shoulders back and his face blank. He hadn't made a scene or protested, but somehow that made things worse. Miss Chandler stopped next to him and cleared her throat, forcing a tight professional smile on Mr. Vance. She started speaking less firmly, her voice no longer carrying the same authority it had before. "There has been a misunderstanding. I'd like to take you back to first class." Ethan slowly looked up at her, his calm gaze locking onto hers. "Miss Chandler," he repeated, "misunderstood." Miss Chandler's hands were clenched tightly, and for the first time in years, she struggled to find her words. "Yes, I regret the error. Please allow me to assist you back to your original seat," she said quickly. A few people nearby stopped pretending not to listen. They had seen everything before, but now they were seeing something new, a flight attendant who had been so sure of herself suddenly going back on her word. Miss Chandler blinked, confused, and asked, "Excuse me?" Ethan sat forward a little, his tone still calm but firm. "Why are you moving me back now? You seemed sure I didn't belong up there early." A few other passengers exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Miss Chandler's throat felt dry. There was an error in seating. Ethan studied her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Miss Chandler shifted uncomfortably, her confidence cracking under the weight of his gaze. Ethan Vance made her feel something she wasn't used to feeling, responsible. "I had my ticket," he said, "and you saw it." Miss Chandler stiffly agreed, yet she still asked me to move. Ethan continued, "You didn't check the system. You didn't ask anyone else in first class to show their ticket, just me." The air around them felt heavier, and Miss Chandler opened her mouth to speak, but for the first time she had no defense. Ethan leaned back and watched her, his face unreadable. "If you're going to apologize," he asked. "At least tell the truth," he said in a steady voice. The cabin fell into a suffocating silence, and Miss Chandler could feel all eyes on her. She had spent years following rules and dealing with difficult passengers without giving it a second thought, but this time she had been wrong, and everyone knew it. Chandler's face burned as Ethan's words settled in the air. People were now waiting, watching, and their interest turned to expectation. She had spent years controlling situations like this. She used to be in charge of deciding who was wrong and who needed to be corrected, but now he was. She pursed her lips but couldn't say a word. What could she say about how she hadn't thought twice before removing him and how she had judged him not by his ticket but by how he looked? She had never been questioned like this before, especially in front of a full plane of people. Ethan didn't gloat or smirk. He didn't even raise his voice, which made things worse. He was just waiting patiently, like a teacher watching a student struggle to find the. Miss Chandler took a deep breath and felt the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She knew the only way out of this situation was to do something she had never had to do before: admit she was wrong. She straightened her uniform and forced herself to look at him directly. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter and lacking the authority it usually had. "I didn't check the system, I made an assumption, and I treated you unfairly." A few passengers looked at her, some surprised that she had actually said it, while others didn't seem impressed. It had taken this long. Ethan nodded once, as if he already knew the truth but wanted to hear her say it out loud. Miss Chandler moved her body and looked around as the uncomfortable truth of the situation hit her. She wasn't just apologizing to him, she was apologizing in front of the whole flight. She cleared her throat and spoke in a more professional voice. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. I should have checked your ticket instead of assuming there was a mistake." Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, but couldn't read her face. After what seemed like forever, he stood up. As soon as he did, the tension in the cabin changed. Miss Chandler breathed a sigh of relief that he wasn't going to make things worse. She quickly moved out of the way and motioned for him to follow her back to first class. But before he did, Ethan turned slightly and spoke again, this time to a passenger who was still watching the scene. "Funny how I was told to move so quickly," he said in a steady, almost casual voice. "But when it was time to fix the mistake, it took a little longer, which made people feel uneasy." Some people in the economy section nodded subtly to agree, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the truth that was now sitting right in front of them. Miss Chandler didn't answer. She just turned and led him back to first class, feeling the stares from every row she passed. Her uniform had never felt so tight, and her usual confidence had never felt so fragile. For the first time in her career, Chandler realized that this wasn't just about one passenger, it was about what happened when power went out. Miss Chandler walked stiffly ahead, each step heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes pressing against her back. No one was whispering anymore. They didn't need to. Silence was more judgmental than words ever could. Ethan followed at a steady pace, unhurried and unbothered, as if he had all the time in the world. The first-class passengers turned to look at him when he re-entered the cabin, their faces a mix of confusion and discomfort. Some quickly looked away, suddenly interested in their. Others, who had seen the scene earlier, moved around in their seats, knowing full well what was going on. When Ethan got back to his original seat, he calmly adjusted his bag and sat down. He never looked at Miss Chandler, who was standing next to him. Miss Chandler swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay professional even though her chest was getting tight, because the moment had gone on for too long, and she knew she had to say something. "If there's anything you need, Mr. Vance, please let me know." "Ethan." He slowly turned his head toward her, but his expression couldn't be read. He let the words hang in the air before responding, "You didn't ask me that." That sentence hit her like a slow, deliberate punch in the gut. Miss Chandler blinked, but she knew exactly what he meant. She had greeted every other first-class passenger with a bright, polished smile, offered them drinks before takeoff, and made sure they were comfortable, but not him. She had walked right up to his seat, asked him questions, and then removed him without hesitation. The power shift was complete. For the first time in her career, Miss Chandler was being watched, judged, and held accountable. "I'm sorry about that too," she said, her voice quieter and lacking the confidence it had before. Ethan didn't answer. He just gave her a slow nod and started flipping through the pages of the in-flight magazine, as if she wasn't worth any more of his time. It wasn't mean or hostile, it was just dismissive. Miss Chandler's throat tightened, and she quickly turned and walked back toward the galley, keeping her steps even and her shoulders squared. She would have let them see her break, but her hands were shaking inside. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hughes put the in-flight phone back on the hook, his jaw tight. He had been in aviation long enough to know what was going to happen next. He turned to the co-pilot, who had been listening carefully the whole time, and said, "We'll be receiving." "So is she fired?" Captain Hughes asked through his voice, and even the co-pilot hesitated. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "Not my call," he said, "but I'll tell you this will just go away." The cockpit fell into a thoughtful silence, with the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Back in first class, Ethan sat back and lightly tapped his fingers on the armrest. He wasn't angry or cocky, he was just waiting because he knew something Chandler didn't know. The real consequences weren't over by a long shot, they were waiting for her when the plane landed. The plane had flown smoothly through the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere wasn't steady. Tension hung in the air like thick, undeniable humidity before a storm. Chandler stood in the galley, her back against the counter, and breathed slowly and deliberately. She had spent years mastering control, learning exactly how to deal with difficult passengers in tough situations, but this was unlike anything she had ever seen. She had her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the counter as she thought back over the last few minutes. She had to walk back through economy, the same aisle she had sent Ethan down earlier, and every single passenger had seen it. From the looks on their faces and the murmurs, it was clear they weren't just watching a flight attendant do her job, they were seeing her fix her mistake and even more so, see her lose. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you really sweating this, huh?" Miss Chandler snapped, "I don't need your input right now," but her voice lacked the bite it usually had. Sienna stood near the entrance to the galley with her arms crossed and her head tilted slightly. "I'm just saying you don't look as competent as you did 20 minutes ago," she said with a smirk. Miss Chandler's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to have this conversation. She had worked hard for her position, risen through the ranks, and made decisions based on efficiency, order, and professionalism. Despite being sure she had done the right thing, she was now holding on to the counter like it was lifeline and feeling her world tilt. Sienna sighed and shook her head. "You know, if you had just treated him like any other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening." Miss Chandler gave her a mean look. "I didn't do anything wrong." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "From where I'm standing, you didn't check his ticket, you embarrassed him in front of everyone, and now you had to bring him back like a kid sent to the principal's office." It made Sienna's voice sharper because they both knew what was going to happen when the plane landed. Miss Chandler felt a cold chill go down her spine. She hadn't let herself think about it yet. What was waiting for her when the plane landed? A passenger complaint, a meeting with a supervisor, a warning, or even worse, the end of her career? She pushed the thought away because she didn't want to let one passenger ruin everything she had worked for, but deep down she wasn't sure if she could handle it. In first class, Ethan Vance was sitting comfortably in his seat, but he wasn't calm. He was thinking about the bigger picture and how what had just happened affected everyone. He had worked in the airline industry for years and knew how things worked from the top down. This wasn't just about one flight attendant making a bad decision. It was about how many others, like Miss Chandler, had done the same thing to others without getting in trouble. He grabbed his phone and began scrolling through his messages. There was already a new one waiting for him. His assistant was finalizing the details, and there would be an official response after landing. Ethan smirked a little. He knew what that meant. This wouldn't be a quiet slap on the wrist. Miss Chandler wasn't just going to be talked to, she was about to be punished. He put down his phone and looked around the first-class cabin. The people who had seen him being escorted out earlier avoided his gaze. Funny people only cared when they realized they were sitting next to someone with power, but what about the times it happened to people without power? What about the times they never got an apology, their seats were taken back, or the chance to see the person who made fun of them fall apart under the weight of their mistake? Ethan tensed his jaw a little and thought, maybe it's time to change that. He leaned back and stretched his legs out a little. The plane was still in the air, but the fallout had already started. The plane kept its steady course through the sky, but for a while was. For M. Chandler, time was moving much more slowly. Every second seemed like it would never end as she stood in the galley, holding on to the edges of the counter. The once firm ground beneath her had turned to sand, and she could feel herself sinking with each passing minute. For Ethan Vance, on the other hand, time was moving quickly as things were falling into place and decisions were being made behind the scenes. For the rest of the passengers, there was an undeniable shift in energy, even among those who had been completely calm before. Start of the flight could tell that something bigger was happening, but no one knew how big. M. Chandler's fear was growing. Miss Chandler took a slow breath and tried to calm down. The rules, structure, and sense of control she had always relied on had all been turned against her in just a few minutes. She had been wrong for years because she thought her instincts were always right and she had the power to decide who belonged where, but now, for the first time in her career, she was being. Sienna, who was still leaning against the galley door, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm but tinged with something else. You should probably sit down before you fall down. Miss Chandler gave her a glare, but it wasn't really mean. Instead, she shook her head and forced herself back into work mode, reaching for a tray and straightening her glasses. I have a job to do, she muttered. Sienna gave her a long look and smirked. For now, Miss Chandler pretended not to notice. She had dealt with rude executives, demanding travelers, and people she had called and moved around to keep order, but this wasn't just about where to sit, it was about who she had judged and insulted in front of the whole plane. As she put the glass back on the tray, her hand shook slightly as she realized she had just embarrassed the one man on the plane who could end her career with a single email, and she had done it. She looked at the cockpit and wondered if she should go there to defend herself before they landed, but she knew deep down that there was no way to fix this. Ethan's next move back in first class, Ethan looked through his emails, his face calm but focused. His assistant had already sent a preliminary report, and as expected, it was being taken to the next level. He knew this airline inside and out and knew how to handle situations like this. Chandler wouldn't be quietly reassigned to another flight. This would be looked at the highest level, and not just for her, but for the whole staff. It wasn't about one mistake, it was about how many times things like this happened without any consequences. He looked up briefly and noticed the awkward looks from other passengers. Some had seen what happened, but they chose to ignore it because they knew who he was. Now they weren't sure what to do because they knew who he was. Ethan slowly let out a breath and stretched his fingers before typing out a quick message. "Ethan, we're landing in less than an hour." His assistant replied right away, "Assistant, they'll be waiting at the gate." Ethan's face didn't change. He had never been the type to yell or throw his weight around pointlessly, but there were times when a quiet lesson was more important than a loud one, and this was one of those times. The rest of the flight crew noticed that the other flight attendants were whispering in the galley. Even those who had been neutral at first could feel the fallout coming. One of them, Jacob, nudged Sienna and asked, "What's going on?" Sienna crossed her arms and said, "Channing messed up badly." Jacob frowned and said, "Yeah, I saw her move that guy." But Sienna cut him off, "That guy is Ethan Vance." Jacob froze and his eyes widened slightly as the full weight of that name sank in. "No way," he muttered. "She kicked him out of first class." Sienna smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Damn, she's done, isn't she?" Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. "If she's lucky, she'll just be fired." Lucky for Sienna, she looked over at Ethan sitting in first class, completely calm and in charge of the situation. She shook her head and asked, "Jacob, what do you think happens when you embarrass the man who owns the sky you're flying in?" Jacob let out a low whistle and looked over at Miss Chandler, who was still standing in the galley pretending to be busy, but everyone could see she was sweating. "The descent begins," the captain's voice came over the intercom. Through the intercom, the voice was smooth and professional, but there was an unspoken weight to it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting our descent. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We'll be landing shortly." Ethan buckled his seat belt without a word, but he did check his phone one last time. There was a new message: "Assistant security has been notified. The executive team will be waiting at the gate. Miss Chandler is expected to report immediately upon landing." Ethan smiled. He put his phone back in his pocket slightly. He didn't like seeing other people suffer, but he did believe in accountability, and Miss Chandler had no idea how much trouble was waiting for her just beyond the runway. The descent had begun, but for Miss Chandler, the real drop was just beginning. She stood near the galley with her arms crossed over her chest and stared blankly at the seat belt sign above her. She could hear the low murmur of people buckling their belts and the rustling of their belongings. She could hear the normal sounds of landing preparations, but all she could think about was the sinking realization that this flight would not end like any other. She had thought for years that she understood power and that she could take control with a firm voice, a straight back, and a competent stare, but now she was starting to understand that real power didn't need to shout or argue, it just waited. Right now, Ethan Vance was waiting for the last few minutes in the air. He sat comfortably and lightly tapped his fingers together. As the plane continued its gradual descent, he didn't want to embarrass Miss Chandler just for fun. He wasn't a mean person, but this wasn't about him either. He had been in the airline business long enough to know that this kind of thing happened more often than people like to admit. Passengers were judged, dismissed, and most of the time they never got justice. But this time was different. He could feel the change in the air not only from the change in altitude, but also from the way the whole crew was acting. Attendants who had once moved competently through first class were now sneaking looks at Miss Chandler, and some of them had already moved away from her as if they could sense what was going to happen. Sienna and Jacob, who were standing near the aisle, exchanged a quick glance. Neither of them said anything, but they both knew Miss Chandler was done, and Miss Chandler herself knew it too. Landing approach, the final countdown, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Cabin crew prepare for landing, Miss Chandler's." She straightened her shoulders to calm her breathing and act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. In less than 10 minutes, she would be walking off the plane not as a senior flight attendant, but as a woman walking straight into a storm. She had to think about what she could do. Would an apology be enough? Could she explain her way out of this number? She had already apologized, and Ethan had already decided that this wasn't just a matter of whether she kept her job, it was a matter of whether she would be able to leave this flight with her reputation intact, and deep down she knew the answer. That touchdown was the moment when everything changed. The wheels hit the runway with a firm jolt, and the plane began its controlled deceleration. The engines hummed louder for a moment before easing into a smooth, steady taxi toward the gate. Passengers breathed out, stretched, and reached for their belongings, but Miss Chandler felt like she couldn't breathe. Her hands itched too. She grabbed the in-flight phone and asked the captain if she had to report anywhere upon landing, but she already knew the answer. It was out of her hands. She took one last slow breath and adjusted her uniform, trying to hold on to whatever authority she still had. But when she looked up, she met Sienna's gaze. The younger flight attendant didn't say anything, she just watched, which was worse. The intercom cracked with the final announcement, "Please remain seated until further notice." When we got to the gate, the seatbelt sign was turned off. "On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." Ethan didn't move right away. He could feel the tension coming from the galley, the staff, and the few passengers who would put the puzzle together. He wasn't mad or cocky, he was just waiting for Miss Chandler. The worst part of the flight hadn't even begun yet. She had no idea how bad things were going to get when the plane finally rolled toward the gate and two men in dark suits were already there. After going through security, there was a senior airline executive standing behind them with his arms crossed and his face blank. He was waiting for her. The seatbelt sign went off, and people started stretching and reaching for their bags. It was the normal shuffle of disembarkation, but for Miss Chandler, this wasn't like any other landing. She could feel it. The seatbelt sign had barely turned off, but Miss Chandler couldn't move. She sat there. As she stood in the galley with her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, first-class passengers stretched their legs and grabbed their bags as if it were just another light. For her, it was anything but. She looked over at the cabin door and saw security and a senior airline executive standing just beyond the glass. They weren't there for a random passenger bothering them or an airport problem, they were there for her. Her stomach turned. She had always been in charge. She was in charge of making rules and following them, but now she was being called upon. She looked over at Ethan's seat and noticed that he hadn't even stood up yet. While the other passengers were bidding their bags together, making small talk, and stretching, he stayed calm and patient. She knew why. Ethan Vance didn't need to hurry because he knew what was coming, the walk of shame. Chandler took a deep breath, forced herself to stand up straight, adjusted her uniform, and stepped forward. She had always believed in handling things with grace. Now she wasn't sure if being professional would even matter, so she took a deep breath and walked into the aisle. As soon as she did, she could feel the shift passengers who had ignored her before getting her quick looks. Some had seen what happened earlier and figured out something was wrong, while others just followed the tension in the air. Miss Chandler walked past economy, past the seat where she had forced Ethan to sit just hours before, and now she was the one being forced into something. Ethan's exit. As Miss Chandler walked toward the cabin door, Ethan finally stood up. He stretched slowly and deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world, and then he stepped into the aisle with the same calm energy he had kept up throughout the flight. Passengers nearby stiffened as if they realized how much had changed since takeoff. Miss Chandler was the first to reach the exit, standing just a few feet from the airline executive in security. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The executive didn't say a word. Security didn't do anything right away because they were waiting for Ethan to get off first. That's when Chandler realized this wasn't just about taking a passenger out of first class. It was about taking out the wrong one. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her as he walked toward the exit, feeling the power without even trying. He finally spoke to her for the first time since she had to bring him back to first class. His voice was calm and quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Next time, Chuck." It wasn't mean or disrespectful. It was just the truth, which she should have known. As Ethan walked past her through the door, she was greeted by an airline executive with a handshake and a respectful nod, which was a nod she would never receive again. Miss Chandler stared straight ahead, knowing that the walls of her career were closing in on her and that bad things were about to happen. The airline executive finally spoke, and his voice was formal and heavy with the weight of something final. He asked her to come with us. She didn't try to defend herself because she knew for the first time in her life that she was no longer in charge and would never be again. Miss Chandler's legs felt shaky as she stepped onto the jet bridge, with each step heavier than the last. The noise of the airport's announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried footsteps seemed muffled and almost unreal. She had walked these hallways hundreds of times before, always with authority, purpose, and confidence, but now she wasn't. The airline executive, a tall man in a sharp gray suit with a face like stones, walked ahead without looking at her. Once security followed behind her, they were silent but present, making it clear that this was not an auction. She swallowed the lump in her throat and stood up straight, trying to hold on to some dignity and believe that maybe, just maybe, she could still fix this. Ethan's private arrival. Meanwhile, Ethan Vance stepped off the plane into a completely different world. A sleek black car with tinted windows was already waiting outside the private terminal entrance. Lucas Hayes, Ethan's assistant, stood next to it with his tablet and phone in one hand. Lucas barely looked up as Ethan approached Ed. He was already reading emails and messages on his phone. "The board is aware," Lucas said, stepping aside as Ethan slid into the back seat of the car. "They want to handle this internally before anything goes public." Ethan leaned back against the seat and adjusted his watch and asked Chandler to join him. Lucas finally looked up and raised an eyebrow. "She's being led to a private meeting room right now," Ethan said with a small smirk. "I hope she enjoys her last meeting as an airline employee," he whispered. "Are you sure about this? I mean, wouldn't a suspension be enough?" Lucas asked. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan's eyes flickered toward Lucas, his normally calm gaze sharpening just a little. "This isn't about her," he said in a measured voice. "It's about all the people like her." Lucas nodded because he had seen this happen before. Ethan wasn't interested in petty revenge, he was interested in change, and Miss Chandler had become the example. The meeting room final judgment. Miss Chandler was led down a quiet hallway past the usual airport offices and into a small soundproof conference room with a long table in the middle and one chair pulled out ready for her. She hesitated, holding her breath as she stood in the doorway. 3 senior airline officials sat on the other side of the table. They weren't flight supervisors or managers, they were executives, the people who decided who stayed and who was fired, the people who decided her future. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. As soon as she did, the door closed behind her. One of the executives, an older woman with steel gray hair and an unreadable face, folded her hands on the table and spoke to Miss Chandler. "Final, have a seat," she said in a calm voice. Chandler sat down slowly with her back straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. There was silence for a moment, but then the gray-haired executive spoke again. "Do you understand why you're here?" Chandler's mouth felt dry, and she knew that what she said next would affect the rest of her career. She licked her lips to keep her voice steady. There was a problem with seating on the flight, and the second executive, a tall man with a strong jaw and sharp eyes, raised in. Miss Chandler tried hard not to flinch as she spoke. Yes, she said, there was a misunderstanding about a passenger's status in first class. The third executive, a bald man who had been reading over the official report, finally looked up misunderstanding and asked Miss Chandler, "Is that what you're calling it?" The room went silent, and she realized they weren't here to hear her side of the story. They already knew the facts. Reports had been filed, statements had been gathered, and she had been blamed. The gray-haired executive finally slid a piece of paper toward her. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position as senior flight attendant," she said. Miss Chandler felt her stomach drop. "Your employment with this airline has been terminated." The second executive held up a hand. He said, "Your behavior on Flight 417 was unacceptable. You didn't check a first-class passenger's ticket. Instead, you acted based on assumption, and you publicly humiliated someone who had every right to be in the seat. You forced him out of it." The third executive leaned forward, his gaze unwavering, and he told Miss Chandler, "The passenger you humiliated was Ethan Vance." Those words crushed any last hope she had. She had spent years making snap decisions about who belonged and who didn't, and now, for the first time, she was being judged, and she had been found unworthy. It was the end of an era. Chandler stared at the termination letter with tears in her eyes. 10 years of flying experience and one bad choice had ended. Her mind raced with ideas of what she could say to save what was left, but there were no second chances, no negotiations, just the cold, harsh weight of accountability. The gray-haired executive stood to call the meeting to a close. "Security will take you out," and that was it. Miss Chandler slowly rose from her chair, reaching for the termination letter with trembling hands. As she turned to leave, the third executive spoke one last time. "Maybe next time," he said, "you'll think twice before judging someone by their looks." Miss Chandler didn't answer, but as she walked to the door, her vision blurred and her body felt heavier than it ever had. She realized what had happened. It finally hit her. She had been a senior flight attendant when she walked into the room, but now she was just another person leaving an airport with nowhere to go. Miss Chandler walked out of the conference room with her termination letter still clenched in her trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it held all the mistakes she had made on that flight. Security followed her, but they didn't have to drag her out. What would be the point of the long, sterile walk? The hallways of the airline's administrative offices felt strange. Just hours before, she had been the one giving orders, being strict, and taking charge of situations with her authority. Now, she was being escorted out of the company she had spent 10 years working for. Every step she took felt heavier, like she was walking through quicksand. She had lost more than just her job, she had also lost her identity. She had been good at her job, or at least she thought she was. She had been strict, yes, she had been firm. Yes, but she thought that was part of her job, keeping people in line, keeping things in order, and making decisions. Until today, she had never questioned herself about how she had handled things, and what she saw wasn't pretty. She kept picturing the moment when she had questioned Ethan Vance's ticket before even looking at it. She remembered how competent she had been as she dismissed him and how happy she had been when she sent him to economy. She was so sure she was right and that. Security led her through a side exit away from the main passenger terminals. There was no public firing or dramatic scene, just quiet, deliberate consequences. But that almost made it worse because this was the kind of punishment that wouldn't go away. It would follow her. With her reputation ruined, she pushed open the exit door and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. It was the first time in 10 years that she wasn't working at the airport, wearing a uniform, having a title, or having a purpose. She wasn't staff. She didn't belong in this world anymore. She was just another former employee walking toward an uncertain future. Part of her wanted to scream and argue to defend herself, but the whole airline knew what she had done. Her name was probably already being passed around as an example of what happens when you judge the wrong person. Would she ever get hired by another airline? She doubted it. Her reputation was ruined. She had spent years making snap decisions about passengers, and now the industry made a quick decision about her. A few yards away, a black luxury car was parked near the private exit inside. Ethan Vance watched as Miss Chandler walked out and stood still in the open air, as if she didn't know where to go. She hadn't seen him yet. Lucas, Ethan's assistant, checked his phone and then looked up to see that she was out. Ethan didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his face unreadable. "She looks lost," Lucas added. After a moment, Ethan finally let out a breath through his nose. "She should be Lucas." Lucas nodded and asked, "Do you think she'll learn anything from this?" Ethan leaned his head back against the seat and stared at the roof of the car. "I don't know," he admitted. "Some people do, and some people don't." "Do you think she deserved to be fired?" Lucas asked. "Yes." Ethan thought about it. He wasn't a mean person who liked seeing people lose everything, but this was never about revenge, it was about accountability. "I think she deserved to know what it feels like to be fired without a second thought," he finally said. "Because that's exactly what she did to me." Lucas didn't argue. They both knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about how powerful people abused their power, and today, for once, the consequences fell on the right person. Chandler's last moment of denial, she finally moved, took out her phone, and shook her fingers as she scrolled through her contacts. She needed to call someone, a friend, a former coworker, someone who could help her. She needed to find a way back into the industry because if she didn't, she had nowhere else to go. She clicked on a contact and called a former manager she had worked with years ago. The phone rang 3 times and went to voicemail. She swallowed and tried calling another contact, but it went to voicemail again. Her stomach tightened with something cold and sharp. They all knew no one was going to help her because no one wanted to be associated with her name now. She had spent years making decisions about other people, but now the industry had made a decision about her. The last shift, she slowly put down the phone and stared at nothing. She felt numb because she finally understood how other people saw her, not as a leader or a professional, but as someone who had let power get to her. Now she had none left. She had judged the wrong person, and the price was everything. Ethan's last words. Ethan watched her from the car, his face still blank. Lucas was silent next to him. Ethan finally spoke, but not to anyone in particular. "Maybe next time she'll think twice." He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath as the car pulled away from the curb. This time the lesson wasn't for him, it was for her. Miss Chandler stood on the sidewalk outside the exclusive airport exit. She couldn't put down the phone because she was shaking so badly. She had called every single person she could think of, but no one had answered. It made her stomach turn because the industry had turned its back on her before she even had a chance to explain herself. She had spent her whole career thinking she was untouchable. Senior flight attendants didn't just get fired, they were reassigned, transferred, and given another chance, but this wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with a quiet meeting. Because this wasn't just a seating problem, it was a public humiliation caused by a decision based on bias instead of facts, and it happened to the one person who could make sure she never worked in the airline industry again. Her breath came faster now. Panic was setting in. What was she supposed to do? She had worked hard for 10 years to build her career, working long hours, overnight shifts, and dealing with difficult customers. She thought she had earned her place at the top, but she hadn't. It only took a minute for everything she had done to be forgotten. Her eyes followed the sleek black car as it disappeared from view. Ethan was gone. He had walked off the plane with his reputation, his authority, and his career unquestioned. She had walked off with nothing. She knew he hadn't done this to be mean. That was the worst part. He hadn't yelled at her, demanded she be fired, or even been angry. He had just let her dig her own grave because the moment she refused to check his ticket, the moment she decided he wasn't deserving of first class based on an assumption, she sealed her own fate. She had done this to herself, and now she had to face a truth she had never wanted to face. How many other people had she treated the same way? How many times had she turned someone away because of their looks? How many people had been forced into economy, where they were uncomfortable and embarrassed, with no way to fight back? The only difference was that they didn't own the airline she had just taken. Now she had to sit in the discomfort of her own choices with nowhere to go. A gust of wind blew against her, but she barely noticed because her mind was racing with what to do next. She couldn't just walk back into the airport and act like nothing had happened. She also couldn't just apply to another airline and hope they wouldn't hear about this because they already had. The airline industry was small, and news spread quickly. Even if this incident never made the news, the right people already knew. Every job application she sent was turned down, and every letter of recommendation was ignored. Worst of all, she had no backup plan. This job had been her whole life, and she had never had to think about what she would do if it went away. Now she had to figure it out on her own. A couple of airport workers walked by her, chatting, as she made her way to the staff entrance. She had been through that door many times before, but now she was locked out. It was the end of a world she had been in charge of for years. She tried to tell herself it was unfair, that she had been treated too badly, and that she deserved another chance, but she knew the truth. She had built her career on making judgment calls, and today she had finally been given one. She left the airport not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to go, and for the first time in her life, she was the one being left. Every step Miss Chandler took away from the airport felt heavier than the last. The smooth, polished floors of the terminal were now replaced by the rough, uneven pavement leading to the faraway parking lot. She had once ruled over the flights, the staff, and the passengers. The unchallenged authority she had carried for years was no longer hers, and for the first time in 10 years she had nowhere to go. She had always thought of the airport as her second home. She had learned every detail, from the break rooms where she sipped coffee before early morning flights to the customer service desks where she watched travelers fumble with their papers. She knew the airline codes by heart, the emergency procedures like they were second nature, and the best ways to deal with passengers, or so she thought. But now that she was leaving, none of that mattered. She was just another person leaving, stripped of everything that had once made her important as a security officer. He stood near the employee exit and watched her walk by. He had seen her many times before, when he was rushing to flights and giving orders that demanded efficiency. Now she was just another face, another fired worker, another mistake. As she walked out of the airport, she didn't look at him because she couldn't. Her chest tightened as she stepped through the automatic doors and into the late afternoon heat. For a brief, desperate moment, she almost turned around and walked back inside, but there was no time. There was no one left to listen to her last attempt to take control. She pulled her phone out of her pocket again, this time with shaky fingers. The contacts list blurred before her eyes as she scrolled down, her mind desperately searching for someone who could help. Maybe she could talk to an old boss, maybe she could find a way to get back on the job, maybe she could fix this. But as she clicked on name after name, one thing became painfully clear: no one was answering voicemails or reading messages. She tightened her grip on the phone. After years of enforcing order, making decisions, and controlling people's fates, she felt helpless. She had spent her career deciding who belonged and who didn't, and now she wasn't even sure where she belonged. She let out a sharp breath, blinking hard, and forced herself to keep walking. She wouldn't break, she refused to. She had been a flight attendant for 10 years and had seen grown men cry over missed flights, families cry over lost luggage, and angry passengers become nothing when their demands weren't met. She had seen people lose their tempers, patience, and dignity, but now it was her turn to be the victim of a reality she had once enforced, and it felt different when it was happening to her. Ethan's final decision. Meanwhile, Ethan Vance was sitting in the back of his car, watching the airport get smaller in the distance. Lucas was sitting next to him, his laptop open, reading the final report from the airline's executive team. "Her firing is official," Lucas said after tapping the keyboard for a moment. It was a violation of policy, but no public statement would be made. Ethan gave a slow nod and lightly tapped his fingers on the armrest. He wasn't surprised. Big companies don't like to admit when something goes wrong. They'd handled it quietly. Chandler's record would be erased from their database of employees, and the whole thing would be forgotten. It was the airline industry's way of moving on without consequences, but this time there were consequences. Ethan turned to. "If she's been trying to fight it," Lucas shook his head and said, "she's been calling people but no one's answering. Her connections are already pulling away." Ethan wasn't surprised. In this world, reputation was everything, and Miss Chandler's was already ruined. Lucas hesitated and looked at his boss. "Do you ever feel bad about things like this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window and said, "I don't like seeing people lose their jobs." An eyebrow was raised, but Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't like seeing people get away with treating others like they're nothing either," Ethan said. "How many other passengers have been treated the same way she treated me without anyone stepping in?" Lucas didn't need to answer. They both knew the truth. Ethan had been lucky. He had power. He had a voice. But the countless others who had been forced out of first class, they had no voice. No one had fought for them, Ethan said. This was important. It wasn't just about Chandler losing her job. It was also about sending a message that said, if you think you can be unfair to people and get away with it, think again. Ethan leaned back in his seat and took a quiet breath. Lucas looked at him and said, "That's it." Ethan gave a small nod. "That's it." Miss Chandler's final realization. As she reached the far end of the parking lot, her legs hurt and her mind was racing. She stopped at the bus stop and stared ahead at the empty street for the first time since the accident. Because she chose to go on that plane, she had to sit by herself without her uniform, title, power, or an excuse. She had been fired, her co-workers had left her, she had lost everything, and for the first time, she couldn't blame anyone but herself. It wasn't Ethan Vance who had hurt her, it was her own decisions. She sat down on the metal bench, her hands on the edge, her mind racing. She had once thought that power meant. Now she finally understood that real power wasn't about controlling people or putting them in their place, it was about respect. She had spent her whole career denying respect to the people she was supposed to serve. Now she was the one who had been left behind and forgotten, and for the first time in her life she knew what that felt like. As the sun went down over the airport, Chandler sat in silence, staring at the sky. All she could think about was the weight of her mistakes. Feel free to leave your thoughts on this story in the comments section below. If you like the video, don't forget to like, follow, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more stories like this.